city and the suburb need each other. There should be more cooperation. But the fact of the matter is the suburb gets the benefit of the city without having to pay for it.
We get a little tired of that charge. Much of the money being used to provide basic services is coming right out of the suburban taxpayers' pocket.
The suburbs are but the satellites, and the center city is the trunk of the tree, and these branches have to be concerned with what happens with the trunk, because if the trunk dies, then the branches die.
Second Sunday, the NBC News award-winning series. This month, the Suburban Sprawl. Here now is NBC News correspondent Virgil Dominic.
People used to live in the city, shop in the city, work in the city. Now more Americans live in suburbs than in cities. We have become a suburban nation, and it's not only the population that is shifting, the wealth is too. Besides sycamores and split levels, suburbia has become shopping centers and industrial parks. What are the successes and failures of suburbia today? Why isn't there more cooperation between cities and their suburbs? How is urban sprawl changing our lives? On this program, we will examine those questions.
Unfortunately, we have in this county some 62 mayors and 62 police chiefs and 62 service directors and 62 of everything when we really need only one.
There's no question but what we should abolish as the suburbs and consolidate them and completely restructure the governmental units in this area. What we really need is an overall government.
The basic problem is one of power. The central city is losing population, and with the loss of population is losing power. And I think it's probably a basic rule of politics at any level that no political entity wants to lose power and is going to fight to retain it.
The nation is growing, and growth means change. Michael Zone, a city councilman in Cleveland, has watched his neighborhood change. Zone talked with Second Sunday reporter Douglas Drake.
How has this neighborhood changed in the last few years, Mike?
It was predominantly Italian in the neighborhood, and now that we've gotten some Southern Appalachians and Puerto Rican people in the area. It's predominantly owner-occupied in the neighborhood here, and the people who have migrated into the neighborhood have fixed up their homes. It was more commercial than it is now. When I was a little boy, it had all those little corner independent stores. Today we don't have that. There are a lot of empty stores now. The supermarkets, the suburban shopping centers have just taken hold. With the advent of freeways and cars, people are very easy, can go to the shopping centers. I used to walk downtown for where I lived, and all the shopping I wanted to do was there. The schools were here, the churches were here. Today, the shopping is not there. For me to go to the best eating spots and the entertainment and theaters, I have to go out seeking them out into the suburbs.
What about the population number-wise? Has there been a decrease or an increase in the last 30 years, say?
There's been a sizable decrease in the population. If it were not for the influx of people coming from the European countries, we'd be really down low. The younger, my children, both of my children who were married, both moved out, so it's the younger ones who are moving away.
Why?
Better housing, for one, and they feel that they're open space more so. Here we don't have it. The streets are very narrow, and the shopping centers are out there.
Where have the people gone? Seems like there's no one hanging on. Look through the windows, the houses are empty. Hey, everybody's out of town.
While the cities were changing, so were rural areas. Small towns grew. Many farms became housing developments. Americans were on the move, seeking the split-level good life with two-car garages, green lawns, new schools, seeking to get away from crime and racial problems. Highland Heights, Ohio, outside Cleveland, is an example of the explosive growth of the suburb. William Brennan is the mayor of Highland Heights.
10 years ago, we probably had half the population we have now. Our income was almost completely from single-family residential development. We had no park facilities, no recreational facilities to speak of. We had no industrial development. We had roads which were unpaved. We had no fire department 10 years ago. We relied completely on a volunteer fire department. In the police department, we had 4 full-time men versus 11 full-time men at the present time.
What about industrial development?
We have less than 10%, I think about 7% of our land zoned for industrial development. But that development is resulting in about 30 to 40% of our property tax duplicate. So we're still basically in a residential community.
Well, how do your residents, especially your older residents who have been around for 10 years, feel about the change? Are they all for it, or you get a lot of opposition?
Not a lot of opposition, no. I think in general, most people accept and understand the change and the economic reasons for the change.
Oh, the good life, full of fun, seems to be the ideal.
With the sprawl came growing pains. In many cases, housing went up and people moved in virtually overnight. Schools had to be built, roads, sanitation facilities. In many communities, there was no planning, but rather merely a reaction to growth. Orange County, California is an example of this. Here is Second Sunday reporter Roy Neal.
Orange County is a large slice of Southern California, sandwiched between Los Angeles to the north and San Diego to the south. Its biggest attraction is Disneyland. Its biggest problem is overexpansion. County Supervisor David Baker, what can you tell us about the way in which Orange County has expanded?
At the conclusion of World War II, the general population of the country began to tilt to the west. Los Angeles was the focal point. That was the destination of many people. And then they had to expand into other areas.
This rapid rate of buildup must have created quite a number of problems. Can you tell us about them?
Yes, I think one of the most difficult problems to overcome was the method of transportation or means of transportation. We had rural roads, little two-lane roads between citrus groves. We had agricultural farms, various kinds, dairy ranches, cattle ranches, and these were very narrow and very difficult for people to get through. So we needed to improve our highway system. We had also the problem of meeting the demand of population insofar as schools are concerned. At our peak growth period, which was approximately 80,000 people a year, it was necessary to construct a new school somewhere in our county every 17 days. We had the problem of disposing of solid waste. We had the problem of meeting the services that the municipalities generally serve, but we, as rural communities, had to assume this obligation. We had the problem of water supply and of disposing of the effluent, the sewer lines, the sanitation and sanitary treatment facilities. These all had to be done. Bond issues were sold, and construction was made. It seemed to be a case constantly of trying to catch up rather than to sit down carefully and plan for the future. We have experienced in our 20 years what normally a community will take 100 years to grow. As we grew up as youngsters, we had the rural atmosphere around the communities or the cities that were our focal points of employment and shopping. This had to come about almost overnight in Orange County. We have not met the demand as we should. We're trying now to resolve that.
Do you foresee having to turn off any further expansion, turning people away?
I don't know how that could possibly be accomplished. People in this country have a right to go wherever they want to go and live wherever they want to live. And I don't think that we could close the gate. We have to plan for growth. We have to meet growth. We have to look to the day when saturation will become commonplace in many parts of our county. And at that point in time, I guess people will stop coming.
Two different worlds. We live in two different worlds.
The way Indianapolis Mayor Richard Lugar sees it, there is the real city, the urban cluster we live in, and the imaginary city, the cluster carved into little pieces. Mayor Lugar suggests getting into an airplane and flying over an urban area.
You can see how the houses are together in a cluster, how the road and transportation system brings it all together. In short, how those people that are in this cluster must react politically and economically, socially, hopefully even in a religious sense, if they are to be successful in leading meaningful lives as human beings. So the real city means city boundaries or city governmental structure that pertains to the realities of how people actually live. As opposed to this in America, we have had imaginary cities, municipalities, carved up subdivisions, special service districts, any number of enclaves in which persons simply waited for the roof to fall in or waited in a one-upmanship fashion for someone to go upstream beyond them. It's a fearsome and fearful prospect.
While much has been said, little has been done about ridding the urban complex of its fragmented government. There are literally hundreds of local governments superimposed on one another: city, county, village, township, school district, court system, tax, zoning, planning, streets, police, fire, water, and sanitation divisions. In the Chicago metropolitan area, there are 1,100 such government units, 1,400 around New York City. This fragmentation is criticized by both city and suburb.
Unfortunately, we have in this county some 62 mayors and 62 police chiefs and 62 service directors and 62 of everything when we really need only one. And this is costing the taxpayers tremendous amounts of money in tax monies.
Mayor Ralph Perk of Cleveland.
And the taxpayers really don't know what's happening. They know their taxes are going up, but they don't know what's happening to them. And they continue to support this kind of government because they don't know the truth. They don't know the answer. The simple answer would be to make this a large Cleveland Regional Municipal Authority. And that would be it, to take under its authority all of these municipal functions. Now, someone would say, well, that means Cleveland wants the power. That doesn't mean Cleveland would get the power. The power would be in the hands of the people. The people would elect their representatives from the various areas which are now suburban areas to sit in that government. It wouldn't be that Cleveland is becoming more powerful. In effect, it would mean the suburbs would be beginning to get their recognition as a part of the whole area.
Suburban officials are not convinced that the city is not seeking power. But Irving Konigsberg, the mayor of the Cleveland suburb of University Heights, agrees that the present structure should be changed.
Having a large central city surrounded by a lot of small communities is not the kind of political structure that one would create if you started from scratch. I think if you started from scratch, what you would probably create is one large entity composed of a lot of small entities.
Waste and inefficiency in local government is the rule rather than the exception. And because of the wedge that exists between the city and suburb, little has been done to correct the situation. How did the wedge get there? It began 100 years ago when the rich began building homes in the country. Then in the 40s, after World War II, the middle class with their FHA and VA home loans began moving out. Auto production and freeway construction speeded up the process, and in the 50s and 60s, many industrial concerns were attracted to the suburbs. The city saw its power and tax base slipping, and the old tactics used to prevent this in the past, in many cases, were taken away.
The normal process over the years was that when an area was expanding in population, the municipality or the village or the township next to it when they wanted to get the same services such as sewers and waters and water and transportation, etc., then they had to come into the city. They would have to vote to come in. But those laws have been changed. The courts have said that you've got to supply your sewer services to the suburban areas. They say that you've got to provide water services to your suburban areas. You've got to supply transportation. So those so-called bargaining points are gone. And that's why the cities, their boundary lines are remaining stagnant over the years. There's almost no way at all that you can expand a city. And the population is expanding. The city is older.
This tired city was somebody's dream. On billboard horizon, as black as it seemed. A four-level highway across the land for building a home for the family of man.
As the suburb grew and prospered, the city decayed. City leaders began blaming their problems on the suburbanites, accusing them of being freeloaders.
They participate in all of the services of the city, still find their employment, recreation, cultural activities, and everything else inside the city. Add to the traffic burdens, the transit burdens, and everything else, and sit on their low tax rates out in the country and feel sorry for their city brothers who are having to pay the bill.
The suburbs don't want to be participating in the low-income housing. They don't want to participate with the educational systems that they have in the center city, but they want to be a part of and take over the things that have been built up in the city that they can use, such as your water, such as your sewer, such as your airport. Now, if the suburbs can take over the things that they want, such as your police department and your fire department and these other things that I've mentioned, they don't need anything else that they have in the city.
The suburbanite enjoys a certain advantage, and you can enjoy the benefits the city has to offer, all the cultural advantages and auditoriums and zoos and entertainment without really having to pay the cost of maintaining those facilities. Most of the people who live in the suburbs work in the cities and earn their living there, and yet contribute very little really to the services in the way of police protection, fire protection, so forth that they require when they're there. So it's like having a good thing going. You know, you're getting the advantage of something without having to pay for it.
As we become a more affluent society and as we have a shift in black-white ratios and socioeconomic stratas, and as an individual becomes more affluent, he intends to buy another car and drive to suburbia and not pay the taxes and work in the city and live in the suburbs.
Animosity and resentment built up. Suburban officials depicted the cities as big bullies, seeking to impose their will on the entire metropolitan area. And they vigorously denied the charge the city was giving them something for nothing.
It is true that many individuals live in the suburbs and make their living in the city. By the same token, those people are contributing to the welfare of industry and commercial businesses which exist in the city and which pay taxes to the city. So, at least indirectly, they are contributing to the welfare of the central city.
Most of our residents work in Cleveland, pay income tax to Cleveland, support businesses and stores who pay substantial taxes to the city of Cleveland. Much of the money being used by Cleveland to provide basic services is coming right out of the suburban taxpayer's pocket.
The suburbs are not leeches upon the city. I think some of the studies I have seen that have been made show quite the contrary, that if the suburbs did not exist, I'll give you one specific example, water. Studies that we have made show that the City of Cleveland Water Department would be broke if it didn't have suburban customers. They'd be out of business unless they raised the rates substantially to their own residents. So the water department exists only because, and charges the Cleveland residents a low rate only because it is making a profit on suburban residents.
Many times suburbia pays not only through a sales earnings tax situation as well as heavy property taxes for areas within the community that really are not holding their weight in any way, shape, or form.
The suburb, generally speaking, is the domain of the white middle class. More and more non-whites are moving in, but as the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing sardonically puts it, To find suburban municipalities with a 5 to 10% minority population is to come across islands of democratic living.
I feel that I moved into a white society. And of course, if I didn't want anything to do with it, I never would have moved in the home that I'm in today. And I feel that they should feel the same way. Come in and take a part and see what you can do. And see, can you work with this party or with the people who are here. And if there's anything you want, ask for it or get involved and see just what he can do for you or what we can do as people, not as a black and white thing.
Mrs. Hattie Prince and her family moved to the suburbs from the ghetto 8 years ago. Her main reason was a better home and school for her children. The neighborhood was about 1/3 black then. Now it is nearly all black.
We have a thing in Warrensville Heights where black live on one side and white live on the other. And I know now that blacks are moving over to the area where there was just all white at a time. And I understand that people are getting ready to put up their homes now to move out because blacks are coming in.
Second Sunday discussed racism in the suburbs with Mayor William Brennan of Highland Heights, Ohio, a Cleveland suburb of 6,000 residents, but only one black family.
My personal belief is that the objections to blacks are basically founded in economic fear rather than racial fear. I think that people feel that the movement of a black family onto their street, for example, will destroy their property values. And I think this is what they fear more than the fact that it's a black family living on the street. And you have to understand the background. Most of the people who live in a community such as Highland Heights own their second home, and most of them have moved from an area that went through a transitional period. And they're fearful of the same thing happening again. But I think the only way the problem can be resolved is for people to face up to it and admit that there is a problem and try to seek solutions. Oh, I don't know the solution. The problem is aggravated by blockbusting tactics, for example. I think if the people on the street felt that if one or two families moved into the street and there would be no further repercussion, and that people were free to move or not move based on their own decisions rather than economic factors, I think a lot of the fears would dissipate.
Whatever the reason, newcomers who do not fit established economic and racial standards are about as welcome as Dutch elm disease. This is the suburbia that civil rights groups refer to as the white noose around the cities.
When a black person in the inner city thinks about the suburb, is this a negative or a positive attitude?
It has some of both.
This is Ernest Cooper of the Urban League.
A negative in the sense that, well, we really aren't welcome there, because experience has shown that the efforts on the part of those who tried to move have been thwarted in many instances, or certainly frustrated like mad. Positive in the sense that I wish I could make this kind of move, not because I necessarily want to live in suburbia, but because this is where there is available the kind of housing I would one day like to occupy. So I think it's unfair to those who are trapped in the inner city to say that their only choice to escape inadequate and poor housing and deteriorated housing is to have to move to suburbia. People need to have the choice of good, decent housing in the inner city as well as good, decent housing in suburbia, and let people make a choice. Then you have an open housing market.
What about the big controversy over public housing in the suburbs? How do you view that situation?
For many of our lily white areas, the introduction of public housing to them means introduction of black families. I'm aware of suburban communities who are delighted to have low-cost, public and supplied housing, as long as it's going to be for the elderly, for our community. So the opposition isn't into public housing and low-cost housing. It's the opposition to the idea of equal opportunity in public housing and the fact there may be black residents in those units.
The tool used by the suburbs to keep poor people out is zoning. Zoning is the power. It determines the character of a community, bedroom or industrial, houses or apartments, parks or shopping centers. Large families cannot move into one-bedroom apartments and may not be able to afford a house on a 1-acre lot. So if large lots or small apartments are required under the zoning code, this excludes a large number of people, poor people. Mayor Brennan foresees a change coming, however.
I think we all have to recognize that zoning as we know it, or as we have known it in the last few years, is not going to continue in the future. I mean, there are dramatic changes that are going to be imposed on us, zoning as a tool to exclude people, or the concept that a community may zone to attract factories, but then by zoning prevent the people who work in those factories from living in the community. These kinds of things are subject to attack at the judicial level, and I think we're going to have to recognize that there are going to be some changes.
In one city, the change has begun already.
In Dayton, we've come up with a regional plan. I think it's one of the best in the country.
The mayor of Dayton, Ohio, James McGee.
We feel that a certain portion of the low and moderate income housing should be out in the suburbs. And we've made a concerted effort throughout our whole regional area to get involved every one of these local communities. Now, to an extent, we got the councils to go along with this. Implementation has been a little more difficult than some of the other things getting it done. But I think we have the idea on paper. Now we just have to get it resolved in the minds of the people. Now, many of these persons are working very hard at this and trying to get these low and moderate income housing out into the suburbs, because they realize that if you have a parallel kind of segregation where $5,000 people are all together, $10,000, $15,000, and $20,000 people are all together, you're not learning anything because you become stagnant and inbred. But if you have this vertical kind of a thing where people of many different cultures and many different stratas live and work together, then you've got a different situation. I think this is going to be the salvation of many of the suburbs.
Second Sunday, the Suburban Sprawl will return after a 10-second pause for station identification. You are listening to Second Sunday, the Suburban Sprawl.
If a major manufacturing concern goes into a suburban area, all of its tax duplicate goes there. They then, by their own home rule ability, can zone out poor people or even low-income people that are not necessarily poor. But those people who work in that plant have to live someplace. And that community that does not exclude them is burdened with all of the problems.
An example of what urbanist Alan Fonteroff is talking about can be found in Cleveland, where from 1954 to 1971, between 75 and 80% of all new job opportunities in trade and manufacturing occurred outside the city. In that time, 24 manufacturing firms, each employing more than 100 workers, moved to the suburbs.
In Cleveland, we had 9 different buildings at one time, and you can imagine the problem with coordinating material, coordinating manufacturing efforts, moving material, and all that sort of thing. We had 8 different parking lots, we had office operations in at least 4 different locations. So the ability to build a plant on this kind of property where you can have everything under one roof, it's a tremendous advantage. And I think our employees find it an advantage also.
That was the personnel manager for Tow Motor Company until 1970, located in Cleveland's inner city, now located in suburban Mentor, 25 miles away. There they have 180 acres of land, with the plant covering 26 acres. Second Sunday reporter Douglas Drake went to the plant and talked with a few of the 1,800 employees.
Do you like the change out here?
For the driving, nah. Yeah.
Say you do like it?
No, definitely not.
How come?
Well, the mileage I put on it. I live right close to the plant over there. I had a walking distance.
So how much do you drive now?
Oh, I don't know, about 150 a week.
Well, that's kind of expensive, isn't it?
Pretty sure it is. Gasoline and tires and everything.
What about the working conditions?
I don't like them.
Why is that?
I just don't like them, that's all. Ask somebody else, see what they say.
Is it too big, too depersonalized, or what?
That's about it. Definitely
too big,
is.
Too depersonalized. I've worked in the office here and the shop, and I definitely feel that way.
I'd like to make a favorable comment, if I may. Sure. I used to work in a factory in the inner city, and it was the working conditions. It was psychologically, it was sickening. You'd go in there and just depressing. Out here, you have a nice lawn, nice landscape in it. I like it.
Do you get the feeling that things run better, more smoothly out here than they did downtown?
As far as clean and neat and better working conditions, and right, I think it's better all the way around there. But I think on the personal level, I think that you're too. It's too inhumanized. It's too cold, I think.
On the company's part, there are a few negative aspects too. Absenteeism in the suburbs tends to be higher. Hiring new employees can be a problem, especially lower-paid office workers, because of the expense of the long ride. But the advantages, including cheaper land, space for parking and expansion, and lower taxes, far outweigh the disadvantages. In addition, there is the safety factor. Tow Motor, which used to experience thefts and vandalism, says those are no longer problems. Employees don't get robbed going to work anymore or get shot in taverns while having lunch. And car thefts at one time happened once a week at the Cleveland plant. There have been none in 2 years at Mentor.
As plants located in the cities have moved to suburbia, they've taken the jobs with them, and oftentimes there isn't available adequate transportation to enable the inner city dweller to get out to suburbia where the jobs are.
As director of the Cleveland Urban League, Ernest Cooper is concerned with how industrial suburbanization affects the black worker.
And at the end of World War II, when we had tremendous new housing development in suburbia, those persons who were least able to participate in this for economic reasons as well as for racial discriminatory reasons could not move, and they were trapped in the city. So that the growth of suburbia has been basically white, leaving what we see today, the concentration of black inner cities. That is a growing phenomenon.
Mentor, where Tow Motor moved, has only a few black residents. At the factory, we talked with 2 black workers who still live in the inner city. Neither had ever made an attempt to move near the new plant. One of the men was quite outspoken about how he felt about his employer's move.
They bring us out here in the sticks. You understand? They don't maintain nothing for us. The plant out there is hot as a boiler room, but it's cool out here, so the best thing to do is go to lunch.
Seriously, though, aren't you happier with your working conditions here, this big, pretty plant?
Well, I mean, I'm not working for beauty because I'm under the same working conditions as I had before as far as the heating situation. So it's nothing but the change of scenery, that's all it is.
Also, I noticed that the number of employees they used to have who worked downtown or who lived downtown and worked downtown, most of the people used to be from that area. Now they've got a majority of the employees are from Lake County. So there's been a great difference to many people who lived in the inner city. Isn't that true?
There's a large majority of the guys. In fact, a bunch of them, as they knew the move was coming, started buying out here in Mentor and around the areas. And some lived here. But, you know, they knew it was coming, so they moved out here.
How come you didn't move out here?
Well, I mean, life treats me better in the inner city. You understand?
You mean you couldn't move out here because you're black?
No, being black doesn't pose a problem, but, I mean, you know, the lifestyles of blacks tend to keep them with their people in some situations, although it's no money situation that doesn't keep me from moving out here, but I guess that's the way, you know, the situation comes out.
Suburban industrial development, besides what we've already mentioned, has also taken the tax burden off the homeowner. As the mayor of Highland Heights told us earlier, industry is concentrated on 7% of the suburb's land, but pays nearly 40% of the taxes. Left behind in the city are abandoned buildings, unemployed workers, and a gap in the tax duplicate. Of course, this adds greatly to the conflict between city and suburb.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on? We can work it out. We can work it out.
While the cities and suburbs have been changing, local governments continue to operate virtually unchanged. Many citizens and city officials, such as New Orleans Mayor Moon Landrieu, are trying to do something about that.
When America comes to realize that unless some way is found to spread the tax base on the suburban areas, that the facilities that cities have provided are going to deteriorate and evaporate, not only for those who live in the cities, but for the suburbanite as well. And perhaps in an age of enlightenment, we'll understand that there is a need for everybody that lives in the greater metropolitan area of a city to begin acting like one community rather than separate little subdivisions.
The one community or real city concept in its practical use is best known as metropolitan or metro government. In the city of Indianapolis, the nickname Unigov is also used.
It's much like a free enterprise corporation in which the mayor is the president of the corporation. He's elected each 4 years by all of the people. And the board of directors is a 29-member city-county council elected each 4 years by all of the people.
Indianapolis Mayor Richard Lugar sees metro government as a way of halting urban decline through more efficient administration.
The accomplishments of this government have been legion, but they are specifically a reduction in the crime rate in the city and the suburbs, certainly the building of tens of times more roads. We've had a reduction in air and water pollution counts, a coordination of our municipal court reforms with the criminal justice system, a number of new parks, golf courses, and more specifically, I suppose, a coordination of all of these capital improvements and operating principles because our entire government comes together. And there are certainly many obstacles that we face in the present and in the future. But I think that currently we perceive that the future of Indianapolis is one whole cloth, that criminals are mobile, so are problems of the environment, so are problems of transportation, and so are problems of youth and elderly people. In short, if we are to succeed in terms of competition with other cities and to bring about the quality of life that we want throughout our area, we'll have to plan together.
Unigov has also lowered the tax rate in Indianapolis, according to Mayor Lugar. He says unified government is just common sense. There are those who disagree with that, city officials who fear the growing power of the suburbs, suburbanites who don't want to lose that power to the cities, and blacks who see Metro as a way of diluting their political power. Second Sunday talked with Mayor William Schaefer of Baltimore, Mayor Charles Mooney of Fairview Park, Ohio, and Mayor William Hart of East Orange, New Jersey, a big city mayor, a suburban mayor, and a black mayor about Metro government. First, Mayor Schaefer.
We're getting a little concerned now that the metropolitan area concept will be dominated by the counties to the detriment of the city, and this is something that would concern me very greatly. The people in the counties are not very favorable to metropolitan government because in many instances they're not interested in really solving the problems of the city. They're very sympathetic, but when it comes to money, when it comes to taking the action necessary to solve our inner city problems, they like to retreat to the counties.
Suburbanites greatly fear a metropolitan form of government concept because they then see that perhaps they are losing the control over the services that we've discussed. That is, control over their police departments, their fire departments, service departments, recreation, and they too see it perhaps as a dilution of their control over their schools.
I think metro government and the idea is essentially a sound one, but I think they're jiving is the old word that you usually use concerning it. Now, if people are ready to assume the equal share of welfare, the equal share of the sewers and central city schools, the equal share of poor housing, the equal share of parking situations, things of that nature, then no one would kick against metro government. In other words, if they're saying to me as a black mayor and the black citizens and Spanish-speaking people of Central City and poor white people of Central City that they're ready to assume equal tax burdens, if the people paying $3 per 100 are ready to equalize that between the $10 per 100 that we're paying, then you wouldn't have any trouble with metro government. But when you're talking about metro government and people are going to live in the suburbs and continue to pay the small tax and control central cities, where you have your troubles.
Baltimore Mayor Schaefer, suburban Mayor Mooney, black Mayor Hart. But despite what they say, Mayor Hans Tansler of Jacksonville, a metro city, thinks the issue is a simple one, with only one logical conclusion.
When you're a mass of people that lived in a contiguous area and that are separated only by a sign that says this is the city limits and this is you're now leaving the city limits and it's just one continuous row of buildings and people, then the city limits sign ought to be moved, and you ought to move it out to enclose and encompass those people that are living in the suburbia. In my city, Jacksonville, Florida, we had the core city dying. We had the donut ring of suburbia around it flourishing and increasing 300%, and everyone lived outside, worked inside. And of course, we couldn't even support the services in the city. So what we did, we picked up the city limit sign and moved it out and stuck it on the county line. Now, in order to do that, of course, it takes a referendum. An area, at least it did in Florida, I think Indianapolis got around that by doing it legislatively. But there is a way to do it. And when it is done, then people find themselves paying the same level of taxes and getting the same level of services, and then you revitalize the decaying and dying core city that is the metropolitan plight of the nation today.
The fact is that some tax inequities still exist in the metro cities of Jacksonville and Indianapolis. A few communities in both counties remained outside metro, and a few public agencies were not consolidated. The big advantage has been in planning. Before Unigov, East 42nd Street, which ran along the city-county border, was half paved and half gravel. Now all of it is paved. Also eliminated is the chance a 4-lane street will funnel into 2 lanes at the city limits. Urbanists like Alan Forneroff have long believed in metro government, not necessarily as a cure-all, but at least as a positive step.
Well, it would solve a lot of political problems, I think, if the people decided that they were willing to give up the autonomy that they have as separate suburban areas and put this in the hands of a single legislative body that would be fairly representative of the total population. It can't help but make significant changes. Then we would really, in effect, be saying that we care about welfare, crime, housing, education, health care, and all of the urban ills, and we will set out to accomplish some sort of solution. All of the taxing ability, then, of the regional area would be put to work in trying to solve these physical and social problems. And there wouldn't be the competition between an affluent city and a very poor city or a middle-income city in fighting for the tax duplicate where it gets its money, or in trying to slough off the problems on another community, because it's all coming out of the same pocket.
Some cities are taking a step short of metropolitan government. They have set up COGs, councils of government, voluntary organizations composed of elected officials in an urban area. Their weakness is that they have no real power, and COGs often exist merely to promote cooperation among members. The COG, however, does allow local governments to reach across jurisdictional boundaries and work toward solutions without creating another level of government. Housing and Urban Development Secretary George Romney feels COGs do serve a worthwhile function.
This is a step in the direction of creating a mechanism that can develop real city solutions for real city problems. Now, in the case of Minneapolis-St. Paul, the Council of Governments there has actually been given some taxing power and been given authority to meet water and sewer needs, transportation needs, and some other requirements in that area.
In an interview with Second Sunday reporter Cal Thomas, Secretary Romney said there is a need for the federal government to provide leadership in dealing with urban sprawl.
But the final responsibility for this is a responsibility at the local level and the state level, because under the Constitution, we have very properly, in my opinion, vested control over local units of government with the states. After all, the states create local government, and they create local government and shape it. And consequently, this elimination of the balkanization of government at the local level can only be dealt with through state action or through local action.
Well, what about the idea of taxing people who live in the suburbs, commuter taxes, some of which are in operation in New York City, of course, and others in other cities have been tried but have been voted down? Is that one solution or part of a package?
Even though people in the suburbs may feel that where there's no commuter tax or where there's no taxing of non-residents as far as income is concerned, that they're not going to have to help pay for the central city problems. Actually, they are directly or indirectly going to help pay for them. The wise thing to do is the sort of thing that has commenced up in Minneapolis-St. Paul, where the state has enacted a law that requires the communities in the St. Paul, Minneapolis metropolitan area to share the increased tax revenues coming from increased property taxes. In other words, instead of that one community having the full benefit of the increased taxes resulting from such industrial or business expansion, the increased taxes are shared with all the communities throughout the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, and that avoids the sort of competition communities get into that is really not a helpful thing.
Well, you know, the argument is frequently heard, if we can go to the moon, then we ought to be able to do such and such. Well, if we can go to the moon...
Well, going to the moon was simple compared to dealing with the problems we're talking about, because there all you had to do was natural forces. What we're talking about are not only the natural forces, but we're talking with all of the idiosyncrasies of human beings and all the complications of government and private organizations that exist in our metropolitan areas, and that's an infinitely more complex situation than just putting some men on the moon.
The fact remains the world has changed and is changing. Man must continue to find ways to adapt to those changes. Local government reform will come. It will have to. Our cities are spreading out, and as suburbs recede farther and farther from old downtowns, they will inevitably meet suburbs coming the other way. And in the age of megalopolis, there will be a whole new set of problems to cope with, and no room for political parochialism.
Perhaps in an age of enlightenment, we'll understand that there is a need for everybody that lives in the greater metropolitan area of a city to begin acting like one community rather than separate little subdivisions.
We have to recognize that the central city is just part of a real city. The real city is the central city plus all the surrounding suburbs.
If we are to succeed in terms of competition with other cities and to bring about the quality of life we want throughout our area, we'll have to plan together.
I think it's a question of both sides being willing to understand that they have to give some in order to gain some, and that it involves a partnership arrangement.
You've been listening to Second Sunday, the Suburban Sprawl. Second Sunday reporters were Douglas Drake, Roy Neal, John O'Day, and Cal Thomas. Second Sunday was written and produced by John O'Day. Technical staff, John Marenko and Robert Gordon. Your narrator was NBC News correspondent Virgil Dominic. Vic Roby speaking. Second Sunday was produced under the supervision and control of NBC News.